So I want to walk you through taking good reading notes, and today I'm going to use Titus Andronicus, the Shakespeare play, as an example text to do this with. So I'm starting out right at the beginning of the play, and let's see, so scene one, we've got enter the tribunes and senators' loft, and then enter Saturninus and his followers at one door, and Bassianus and his followers at the other with drums and colors. So you can try to imagine how this would look on the stage with them entering at separate doors, right, on two sides of the stage. And so Saturninus gets the first speech here, right? Noble patricians, patrons of my right, defend the justice of my cause with arms, and countrymen, my loving followers, plead my successive title with your swords. I am his firstborn son that was the last that wore the imperial diadem of Rome. Imperial diadem is the crown. Let my father's honors live in me, nor wrong mine age with this indignity. So right away, Saturninus is making a claim to the Roman throne based on the fact that he's the firstborn son of the last emperor. So we might want to here underline some things. Firstborn son. My successive title with your swords. So, right away there's a threat here, right? Threat of violence. I'm just going to put threat. But it's based on primogeniture, which was English common law, the idea that the firstborn son would inherit everything upon a man's death. This is a little bit complicated here, though, because while the idea of primogeniture would have been extremely familiar to Shakespeare's audience, the political situation in Rome, when this is supposed to be taking place, isn't nearly so cut and dry, right? It's clear that Saturninus is making a claim to the throne based on the fact that he's the firstborn son. But, as we very quickly will learn in this very long first scene, that ultimately the decision of who is going to be the emperor isn't, sort of strictly decided by who's next in line by succession in terms of being related to the previous emperor, right? That there's actually a vote that's involved. And so there's kind of a cross thing going on here where this particular version of Rome that we're getting is a kind of democracy, and Saturninus is wanting to lay claim to the throne. He's wanting the support of the people, but he's also sort of doing so by threat, and sort of his main claim to why he should be voted to be emperor is the fact that he's the eldest son of the previous emperor, right? So Bassianus, who we're going to find out is his brother, right? Favors of my right. If ever Bassianus, Caesar's son, so Caesar is the title for the emperor, gracious in the eyes of royal Rome, keep them this passage in the capital, suffer not dishonor to approach the imperial seat, to virtue consecrate, to justice, continence, and nobility, but let desert in pure election shine. And Romans, fight for freedom in your choice, right? So pure election, you should vote for the better person. Bassianus is making the claim that he's the better choice, even though he's not the firstborn son. We've got Marcus here. So we might, we could go through and sort of underline pure election shine. Might make a note about democracy. So Marcus has entered, he is aloft with the other tribunes. right? So he's one of the tribunes. He acknowledges Bassianus and Saturninus as princes. So we know that Bassianus is Saturninus' brother and is the younger son of the previous emperor. And then we're going to get some background on Titus here, right? Have by common voice an election for the Roman emperor, chosen Andronicus. So there's already been a choice made that they voted for Titus. Surnamed Pius, for many good and great deserts to Rome, a nobler man, a braver warrior, lives not this day within the city walls. He, by the Senate, is excited home from wary wars against the barbarous Goths, that with his sons a terror to our foes hath yoked a nation strong, trained up in arms. 10 years are spent since first he undertook this cause of Rome, and chastised with arms our enemies' pride. 5 times he hath returned bleeding to Rome, bearing his valiant sons in coffins from the field, and at this door to the monument of that Andronici done sacrifice of expiation, and slain the noblest prisoner of the Goths. And now at last, laden with honor's spoils, returns the good Andronicus to Rome, renowned Titus, flourishing in arms. Let us entreat by honor of his name, whom worthily you would have now succeed, and in the Capitol and Senate's right, whom you pretend to honor and adore, that you withdraw you and abate your strength, dismiss your followers, and as suitors should, plead your deserts in peace and humbleness, right? So Marcus is chastising the sort of threat of violence that was brought about in their trying to lay claim to the throne, and also pointing out that Titus has already been voted to be the next emperor. And at this point, we don't actually know, it's not clear at all that Marcus is Titus's brother, right? He's been talking about him as though he's just another person. So here Saturninus agrees, and here we find out it's Marcus Andronicus, right? And so we get our first instance of finding out that it's Titus's brother, thy noble brother Titus and his sons. Gracious Lavinia, Rome's rich ornament, that I will here dismiss my living friends into my fortunes and people's favor. At this point, we don't yet know that Bassianus and Lavinia are engaged, but we're going to be finding that out somewhat soon in this, as I mentioned before, very long first scene. You know, I might look for what's some of the important kind of factual stuff that we learn. Normally, I'd want to be looking for some other things in terms of sort of interpretation and analysis, but for just taking good reading notes, sometimes it's just really helpful to know when you find out things in the play, right? So first finding out that Marcus is Titus's brother. Get some chicken scratches on here. We haven't yet learned how many sons Titus has lost. We do know that he's been away at war for 10 years, so that might be worth making note of. And he's come back several times, but basically he's been 10 years fighting with the Goths, whom Rome has finally conquered, right, as we're going to be getting into very soon. All right, so we get a long stage direction here. So we get enter the captain, they go up into the Senate House. So flourish is in brackets. We know that's an editorial intervention. So is the exit of the soldiers and followers. So flourish would be a sound of like trumpets announcing something, would be a flourish. They go up into the Senate House. This is original in the, early modern text of the play. And so presumably Bassianus and Saturninus, who've both entered at separate doors, would go into those doors and then appear in the above space along with the tribunes, right? We get the captain here. He's announcing Titus's return. And we get this long stage direction. Sound drums and trumpets. Then enter 2 of Titus's sons. After them, 2 men bearing a coffin covered with black. After them, 2 other sons. Then Titus Andronicus in a chariot. And then, as prisoners, Tamora, the queen of Goths, and her sons, Alarbus, Chiron, and Demetrius, with Aaron the Moor, and others, as many as can be. Then set down the coffin, and Titus speaks. So one thing to notice here is that the stage in this first scene, at least at certain times, is very, very busy. There are a lot of actors on stage, as there are lots of sort of extras to be the followers and supporters of Bassianus and Saturninus. And now we've got all of these people entering, including, Titus on a chariot and everything, right? Now the chariot, historically would have been pulled by horses, but they couldn't have horses on an early modern stage. It wasn't big enough. So his chariot would have been pulled by people or, sort of pushed on, or maybe both. And that could have involved prisoners. It could have involved extras. It's hard to say. But there wouldn't have been any horses involved because they couldn't have them on the stage. Hail, Rome, victorious in thy morning weeds. Lo, is the bark that hath discharged his freight, returns with precious lading to the bay, from whence at first she weighed her anchorage, cometh Andronicus, bound with laurel boughs, to re-salute his country with his tears of true joy for his return to Rome. So, we get this little, as the bark, we get this simile here, talking about a bark, a ship, discharging its freight and returning with all kinds of precious things, like a trading ship, a merchant ship that's taken freight away and then traded and brought back all kinds of goods, right? So that's the little simile we get here. Thou great defender of this capital, stand gracious to the rights that we intend. Romans, of 25 valiant sons. So here we find out, we get some numbers, right? 25 sons. Half of the number that King Priam had. Behold, the poor remains, alive and dead. These that survive, let Rome reward with love. These that I bring unto their latest home with burial amongst their ancestors. Here Goths have given me leave to sheath my sword. Titus, unkind and careless of thine own, why sufferest thou thy sons unburied yet to hover on the dreadful shore of Styx? Make way to lay them by their brethren. Okay, so there's a tomb. This would probably be in the reveal space between the 2 doors on the back of the tiring house. Or it could be in the trapdoor. That might also work too, the trapdoor in the stage. There greet in silence as the dead are wont, and sleep in peace, slain in your country's wars, O sacred receptacle of my joys, sweet cell of virtue and nobility. How many sons hast thou of mine in store, that thou will never render to me more? So he started with 25 sons. we get Lucius. This is one of his sons that's going to talk here, right? But so that's kind of how we could go about, making some good reading notes, taking some good reading notes as we're going through. Just looking at the very beginning of the play, we're getting a lot of background information here, which we would kind of expect. But there's lots of action and things to watch, too. And so for the beginning of the play, when we're getting some of this kind of factual stuff, it might be most helpful to just sort of note what we're learning when, so that when we were to come back to talk about, how many sons Titus lost, we could have a good clear number of that, and we would know when we find out, right? I would also probably want to go through, and again, it's a little bit tricky here right at the beginning of the play, but normally I'd want to go through and make some notes at the top of the page just to give me some reminder of what happens on that page. So, for this, I might put something like, Prince's claims to the throne. If I can write today, that would help. Titus enters. Sorry, the top of my pen is getting stuck on my little setup I've got here for recording this. Tomora's plea here, right? And so I'd probably make a note of that. So this way, when you are, as you are going along, you take some good reading notes, you get some ideas of what's going on when, and you can refer back to stuff, which you want to be able to do as you're, participating in discussion, answering questions. If you decide to, do an analysis of this for your major paper or something like that, it's much, much easier to work with the play if you've gone through and taken some good reading notes as you were reading it. And also, as I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you've read a good summary of this before you've started reading it, so that you're not just trying to figure out the plot, the narrative, as you're reading. You want to already have a clear sense of that so that you can pay more attention to the language and the details. And that way you're not trying to do that and figure out the narrative at the same time. Okay, so in those last 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to look at some of the notes that come in our edition and make some use of those, and also try to be a little bit more interpretive and analytical now that we've got some of our reading notes laid out, just, sort of observing some of the factual details and things, right? So one of the things we might have noticed over here in our notes, the little marginal notes that we get, there's a mention of followers being dressed in military attire because they're identified as soldiers. And so that identification is helpful. I would actually say, this may have less to do with how they're dressed than suggesting that they're armed, right? That if they're identified as soldiers and followers, that it might be worth thinking of that in terms of having them have, clubs or swords or daggers or something that would help emphasize this threat. So we could connect the fact that they're soldiers to the threat, particularly the one that Saturninus makes right off the bat, right? We could also, again, trying to be a bit more interpretive about this. So we've got data, we've got observations and things to work with, evidence in the text itself. And then what we do with that is where we start getting more interpretive and analytical. So Bassianus's first speech here, we might notice, suffer not dishonor to approach the imperial seat. So it's interesting that Saturninus's claim, his argument, is that he's the firstborn son, and that it would be an indignity for him to not be emperor, not be made emperor, right? Because of his age, because he's the firstborn son. Bassianus's retort to that is that Saturninus would be a dishonor, that for justice, continence, and nobility, let desert and pure election shine. So, just freely elect the emperor without regard for age, because I'm the better choice, because Saturninus would bring dishonor, right? That I represent virtue, justice, continence, and nobility, and he does not, is the sort of implicit argument here, right? Criticism of Saturninus. Which, as we're going to learn, Saturninus is very much the wrong choice, but he is the one that Titus will agree with, and that will be too much to the tragedy of the play. When Marcus chides them, and we could withdraw you, abate your strength, dismiss your followers, pretend, right? As suitors. So instead of coming with a threat, you should be coming as suitors, attempting to woo the people for their support, rather than to threaten them into it, right? We could put love, not war here. It's also interesting that Saturninus gives this one, here, again, we're being more interpretive now. So we would just note short response. That's the evidence. I mean, it's clearly a short response, but then the interpretation could be, what do we want to do with that? That it's short because he's, sort of considering his next move, not necessarily agreeing to it, but then Bassianus very quickly, does agree. I do affy thy uprightness and integrity. And then the stage direction, exeunt soldiers, sorry, my chicken scratches are really messy at this point. And Saturninus is kind of only considering it, This calms my thoughts, but then he doesn't seem to really agree. And Saturninus does address his friends here, right? Friends that have been thus forward in my right, I thank you all and here dismiss you all. So this is a good editorial intervention. We can tell by Saturninus's dialogue that he is here dismissing his followers. And so they couldn't have already exited with this exeunt. So it must come after this dismissal. So that makes sense. This is a good place to put this. But yeah, so it's interesting that Saturninus is kind of thinking about it. Bassianus gives in, and Bassianus is the first one to dismiss, right? So he's the first one to stand down. And this stage direction is also where we get the description of the followers as soldiers. So this is how we can get a little bit more interpretive, analytical, add to our reading notes, take some better reading notes. Obviously, at this point, I'm kind of going back through and adding things. But, you know, ultimately, you want to be kind of deeply engaging with the play. And assuming you don't have enough time to fully, like, read it and then reread it again, you want to try and take as good and thorough of notes as you can as you're reading through the first time, and to make sure that you've already read that plot summary so that you already know what's going to happen, and you can do those notes that pay more attention to the details, word choices, language, those kinds of things.